Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Webdelics podcast, where we're on a journey to uncover the truth about plant medicine and psychedelics, get rid of the myths, and change the narrative. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and with us today is our very special guest, Cory Firth. We are going to be discussing today a topic that might be controversial, but that truly needs to be addressed. And that's a lot of why I am so excited to have Cory with us in the house today. Cory, welcome to the show.
Hey Scott, thanks for having me. It's good to be with you guys in Webdelics today. I'm excited to sit down and
We're
chat with you.
excited too. Now, who are you, Cory? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, it's I always find these. I should have like a stock, like, hey, this is who I am, but I don't have that. So yeah, I'll give you a background of me work wise, professionally, sort of connecting the psychedelic space. I suspect we'll get into more of the story of why I got here, but I've spent the last 5+ years or so building communities inside of the mental health space, and mainly the last 3 years inside of the psychedelic space. I call it a space because it's not quite an industry yet, but we're
Yeah.
forming it as we go. And so I'm here, located in Canada. I run a company now called Neuma, the Center for Social Wellness. I'm the CEO there and co-founder, and we're an experiential learning center specializing in psychedelic training, public health education, and personal development. And so we can talk a little bit more about that if it lands. But before that, I helped start up a nonprofit retreat center in Costa Rica. That was sort of my first venture into the psychedelic world, helping them get started up, buying this really amazing property down there with them and working with the VC firm to establish the brand. That was my first inroads in. And then the pandemic hit and a company was forming out in British Columbia here, the Psychedelic Association of Canada, to help steward the advancement of psychedelic therapy. And they had just started up, raised a little bit of money, and were looking for an executive director. So I joined them for a year just to help them establish some logistics, build a volunteer base, and raise about $250,000 for the nonprofit to help them create sustainability. And then I went to work for one of the largest nonprofits supporting psychedelic research in North America called the Nicaean Foundation. We built a really cool storytelling library where we're bringing people together to share their stories. And the whole concept was based on sort of transform out loud. And the idea being that psychedelics can help you transform, and it's important to share your story as part of the bigger picture of what happens with these compounds and these medicines. And then I helped to also start the first of its kind nonprofit organization, trade association here in Canada, to help sort of legitimize the profession a little bit more. So help do that, and then realized, sort of a lot of that was bureaucratic type stuff, and I wanted to get into more to the creative stuff and the delivery and sort of seeing that end result and getting back into the community. And that's why we started Neuma. And so, like I said before, we're an experiential learning center doing all kinds of really cool things. Father, I'm a partner, I'm a son, community member. I think that's it. I'll try to keep it shorter than it probably, longer than it probably had to be.
But I feel like all of that was really important because at Webdelics, particularly on this podcast, we pride ourselves in making sure that the subject matter expert guests that we have are credible. And let's face it, hearing that bio, I don't think a lot of people would say that you're not credible. In fact, I would say quite the reverse. So thank you for sharing all of that with us. It's genuinely impressive. I also have to say that one of the things I love about hearing guests describe themselves goes as to the choices that they make when it comes to saying who and what they are outside of work, if they say anything at all. And so knowing how you define yourself that way really is interesting and actually directly relates to the subject matter of this conversation. Now, we're here today to discuss something everyone out there in the world seems to claim that they care about. Maybe not everyone, but the majority of people claim to care about, but they don't necessarily live. That is honesty. Honesty. Specifically, honesty when it comes to how we educate our children. And even more specifically, with how we educate our children or have conversations with them about various substances, which I've learned through my Webdelics journey, can be very different from each other, but are all lumped together under this general category of drugs. And by the way, not necessarily by those that are involved with those substances, but in terms of politicians or the general cultural language. And the quote unquote drugs that we're going to talk about today, obviously, are plant medicines. When we talk about how we have conversations around plant medicines with young people in our society, before we go into your feelings about what that should look like, I really feel it's important for the audience to understand why you care. You don't just randomly
Mm,
care for no, you
mm.
didn't wake up one morning and say, of all the subjects in the world I feel passionately about, this is that for no reason whatsoever. And in fact, let's totally keep it real here, like we like to do on the Webdelics podcast, and get to the point. You have a very long history with these substances that we call commonly drugs. Is that not correct?
Correct. Yeah. And Scott, if it's okay, maybe I could just do a little disclaimer off the
Please.
bat because I don't want anything that I say to be taken in a way that's promoting drug use for children or our youth in any way.
Absolutely.
The angle that I come on to talk to you about this today is really, like you said, about honesty and really about just kind of bringing to light something I think we maybe have sitting in the shadows and something that is worth talking about. Did you want me to tell you a little bit more about sort of where I came to this, why I
Very
care so
much so.
much? Is that what
Yeah,
you were
very much
asking?
so. But before you do that, I think that your point about making a disclaimer is well taken. And I just want to use this as another opportunity to say that, as is the case with you, Webdelics is not advocating for any use of substances in any context that is illegal or otherwise inappropriate for children. What we're talking about are the nature of conversations. And so, with that in mind, I would love to hear a little bit more about your life as a young person and how that pertains to this.
Yeah, and I can tend, as you can tell from my intro, I can tend to kind of ramble. So please cut me off if you have anything that little golden threads as we go through this. But so I was born with a low functioning 5-HTT-LPR genotype, which is part of the brain that regulates serotonin. Serotonin being a really important chemical in our bodies and in our brains that help us to regulate our emotions, our nervous system, all kinds of interesting things. Because I have this low functioning genotype, I am more susceptible to suicidal ideation, anxiety, depression. I don't engage well with talk therapy, and our classic Western medicine approach and therapeutic approach, the tools that exist for us today to treat someone with mental health don't work for me. I'm actually a low responder to antidepressants and
Interesting.
SSRIs. So I dealt with depression from a very young age because of that, but I didn't know that when I was younger. It wasn't something they had to be able to test. I found that out when I was 28 that I had that genotype, and so I battled depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation from a young age, and I always had to figure out my own way to dealing with it. And I used drugs in a lot of ways to do that, but I didn't know I was doing that. I guess in a lot of ways, and I didn't have any support in that because I'm a product of the war on drugs, as you are,
Yeah.
Scott. I'm sure, and there was a lot of propaganda that really worked to create a lot of fear and create a lot of repression, and I think hide some of the benefits that are offered from these compounds. Again, not suggesting that I should have been using those or should have been prescribed those at a young age, because there's a real reason for us not to be. But the honest approach to psychedelics, the honest approach to treating your own mental health in your own unique way, the honest approach to talking about drugs in general, talking about mind altering experiences, talking about our chemical makeup, was just gone. Like, it was completely not even available to us, even if I asked. And the real beginning to the connection to drugs came in when I was in grade 4, and I was the type of student, as you may or may not have already guessed, that didn't really do well inside of the classroom. And I was a curious kid. I was the class clown. I didn't like being put in the box that the classroom provided for me, but I really loved the library. I loved going to the library because there was just you could explore anything there. There was no boundary for you. You could pick up a Where's Waldo, or you could pick up an encyclopedia and you could explore something, right? So we in grade 4, we were not rushed to, we were ushered into our library, my whole class, my grade 4 class. And I was excited, right? We're going to the library. Like, yeah, I'll love to hang out there all day. Get me out of the classroom. But when we walked in, all the bookshelves had been moved to the side of the room. And in the middle of the room on the carpet was a 4x6 masking tape rectangle. And standing over top of that rectangle were these 4 big burly cops. And they proceeded, I mean, I don't remember, it was grade 4, so I don't remember exactly what they said, but it was along the lines of sort of the fear mongering and perpetuation of the war on drug campaign and propaganda as a way to establish a level of fear within us at a very, very young age. Like grade 4, you're like 10, I
Yeah.
think, or so. So at 10, that's my first exposure to drugs at any form. Like my parents hadn't talked to me about it. My dad, didn't even really drink. My parents didn't really drink or do any drugs. So they never talked to me about it. Again, it's not like no blame to them. I don't know why it was ever not a discussion really, but that was my first exposure to drugs. And I'm thinking like, what the hell
Hmm.
is this? Like why are we
Hmm.
doing this? Anyway, so long story short, like I said before, I was a pretty curious kid, and sort of always sort of bucked authority, I guess, back then, like I with my teachers
Hmm.
and things like that, or coaches. I always kind of had like that type of relationship. So I didn't quite, I guess, fully believe them. So not long after that, I actually smoked my first joint. So they had told us, if you do drugs, you'll end up in this jail cell, or you'll end up dead. But I kind of took it as like, why would they? Why are they putting this label on them? What if they're so readily available? If I can get them, and they've talked about how available they are, why are they so bad? And I wanted to explore them, I guess, a little bit. And so did a lot of my friends. And unfortunately, because the only approach to teaching us about these substances back then was to scare
Yeah.
us to death about them, we didn't have a lot of support. And so I actually had a few friends that died of overdose, because I think in a lot of ways, I don't blame that
Mm.
whole system on that experience, but you know I think there's a better way to do it, which is why I'm here talking to you, because I'm involved in the psychedelic space. I have a young daughter, but really I have kind of a benchmark. My daughter's 2 years old now. When she's 10 or in grade 4, I want to be able to look inside of the curriculum that she's being taught and understand, if things have changed, if the way we teach our kids about drugs has changed, because then I'll know at least I had some small impact on that. And we talked about some of the impact stuff, but to me, it's about re-educating or rebuilding the system around education. And I think you could also, there's like a lot of parallels to, actually, I'll stop it there, because I think that was enough of like why I'm here, and maybe that we can talk a little bit more about things you thought
Thank
were
you. And there
interesting.
was a lot that was interesting in there. And I'm sure we're going to eventually circle back to some of the things that you're about to say anyway. I just got to say, though, one to one, homeboy to homeboy here, Cory, I was a library kid too. I've never told anyone that before since I left high school. I would love to go. I hung out with all the geeks and all the artists and all the weirdos in the library, so it wouldn't get picked on by the jocks. So I'm glad to know that there's at least one other library boy out in the world, and I've met him through this podcast. But number two, I actually remember the U.S. versions of these campaigns, and they were both effective and ineffective. I remember there was something, and this, if it wasn't this exactly, it was something very similar to this, Scared Straight. And it usually had either these big burly inmates or cops. There were versions on TV, there were versions that would come to the schools, and these men were terrifying. I mean, they were big and burly. If you're a high school kid and they were talking about the dangers and all this sort of stuff, and you would end up in jail, and then all these horrible things would happen to you, it was terrifying. It's like having Mr. T come at you and say, yeah, you want me attacking you? Well, then, yeah, smoke a joint. And on the one hand, I understand the value of that because there was a legitimate concern about addiction. There was a legitimate concern about a whole host of other outcomes of children being involved in a whole host of substances that weren't regulated. But on the other hand, you're right. I was someone that would, the minute I heard authority figures tell me something, especially if, in my opinion, they were resorting to terror to tell me something, or if I, in my little mind, decided that they weren't as smart as I was, which was more people than I'm proud to admit, I would react exactly the opposite and run to it. Sex was a whole other example of that, or making out. If you make out with a girl or anyone for that matter, you're going to go to hell. So of course I wanted to date immediately. And so I, I understand.
Yeah, the I was gonna say before, the parallels between sex education and drug education are very similar. It's just an abstinence approach. It's this: don't talk about it, don't ask about it, just don't do it, but we're not gonna tell you any more about it. We're just don't talk about it, stay away from it. Here's like a really baseline level of information, but other than that, don't ask any
Well,
questions. And that's like completely, in my opinion, completely the problem
and the
in a lot of ways.
discussion around sex education has, at least in the United States, and I assume in Canada as well, been integrated into the cultural space so that people can advocate for and against sex education and conversations about sex without being marginalized for even having the conversation. Drugs, it's a different matter. And one thing, if there's anything that I've learned from hosting this podcast before, not all drugs are the same. Not all drugs are the same. Where it might be legitimate to have one conversation or one tone about crack and not having the same one about cannabis, all the more so when, like plant medicines, some of those directly relate to mental health issues like those that you were having due to you being a particular genetic disposition. What then do you think would be a way that a discussion might happen with young people that would enable us to thread that needle, to not be seen as necessarily endorsing something that could put them in danger, because no one denies that psychedelics or any of these substances present potential risks, but at the same time, has it be appropriately modulated so that people don't remain ignorant about things that could save their lives?
Yeah, well, I think I'm no expert on this, but I'm passionate about it. So I'll give you some ideas and some opinions, I guess, and we can jam on those because I think there's something interesting there. And what I think is interesting is if we look at the history of the war on drugs and the history that psychedelics have taken to get to the point where we're at today. The point we're at today where research funding is now being given. I think they just announced it this week. The federal government, the U.S. government, sorry, has announced a big grant, a couple $1 million towards psychedelic funding for research. Some really amazing stuff. I don't think there's a class of drugs that have been studied as much as
Mm.
psychedelics have, but they're still illegal. And so we've got all this great research. We've got these legalization, decriminalization movements happening, and things look like they're going to change, and regulations are going to come as they've come in Oregon and Denver and Michigan and some parts of California. And here in Canada too, we've had some really amazing things happen with our Health Canada. It's our regulatory body. They've made some changes, and one of our provinces is announcing some plans, and it seems like we'll probably get sort of a nationwide change here soon. Um, so that's great. And we've come a long way. That's taken about 50 plus years to get to this point where advocates like you and myself and other folks like Rick Doblin from MAPS, for example, have been just working so tirelessly to make this happen, find all the little ways to get people to talk about it, to get it to the point where we can have a bigger, larger discussion with politicians and government and our regulatory bodies to make changes for healthcare. But there's even a limit in that we're just so focused on
Mhm.
therapy now. And it's not just about therapy. And so there are all these little talking points and there's all these little things, these little paths, I think, that we can kind of stream off from this. But I think one way to expand the conversation in general with the benefits of psychedelics is to expand beyond just therapy. And I know why we're going that route. I know it's helping to, especially in the US with veterans and
Yeah.
military, and helping to kind of wedge that sort of use case in there. But like the discovery of our DNA was discovered by Nobel Prize winner Dr. Francis Crick, and he said that he discovered the molecular structure of DNA on an LSD trip. So it's not just about healthcare. It's not just about therapy. It's about cultural innovation. And so I just want to kind of make that point first, as saying like in general, we need to just get outside of the therapy discussion, I think, in a lot of ways. Let the great work that's been happening and continue to happen, because I think it's important. But what else is possible? That's just one thought, and we can play with that. But then, in terms of opening up the discussion with the idea of being more honest to our youth about drugs is I think we need to be honest about the implications of psychiatry and pharmaceutical drugs. We need to talk a little bit more openly about the spectrum of drugs and drug interaction and the chemical makeup of our own unique bodies and our own unique human identities, if we want to call it that. Because right now, I see us living in this psychiatrized society, this society that's identified every element of the human condition as a disease. And every single part of that for me feels wrong, where you have someone who really enjoys having sex, that's a disease. Someone who doesn't have enough sex has a disease. Someone who wants their house really clean has a disease. Someone who has too much clutter in their house has a disease. Someone recently told me they were diagnosed with ADHD, and their doctor told them that the symptoms are that they focus too much on things. And then they also told them that they don't focus enough on things. And so it's like, where do we go from here? How do we deal with that? Because to me, those are just natural human tendencies and natural parts of the human condition that I think we need to um, redefine and um, not be so structured around what uh, the profession of psychiatry has created for us and the connection to the pharmaceutical industry. And I don't want to go down a rabbit hole of talking about all this. There's some really great information on YouTube about this what I described. Sort of, I'm just labeling it the psychiatrized society, but a lot of problems with the DSM model, a lot of problems with the identification of certain mental health disorders that have been in place for many years that I think are doing more harm than good. So starting there, I think is really important, and then having the honest approach about what is the fullest spectrum of drugs that are available to us for many different reasons. Like, you can talk about fentanyl having a really good benefit to certain people with pain, right? But if leaks into the black market, gets cut into your cocaine, can be lethal to someone who's recreationally using drugs. So, like, we don't talk about that. We just talk about the bad part. We don't talk about the benefit of fentanyl, for example, or the benefit of cannabis and the risk of cannabis. So, I think it's really a bit more. It has to be a little bit more open. It has to be obviously tailored to age, and we have to figure that out. And I think with everything, we're going to make mistakes in terms of how these things are established, and these educations change or these paradigms change, and people aren't going to love it. But what's working right now for me, the mental health crisis that's spread across North America, the overdose crisis that we're dealing with here in Canada and
No.
in the US as well, th- we haven't figured it out yet. And this feels like a path that we could just, explore a little bit to see if it could be helpful, because it doesn't, we have to obviously fix what's happening here now with those that are in trouble, but also we have to change it so it doesn't just continue the same terrible cycle. So I guess I'll get off my pedestal here and see what you thought was
Well,
interesting there.
that pedestal did lead to some interesting revelations. You reference the psychiatrizing of our society as a rabbit hole. It may be a rabbit hole, but it's a rabbit hole we're going to go down. I just have to say, as an aside, though, before we go down that rabbit hole, one of the things I've loved about this podcast is that I'm learning all of these new $5 words. Psychiatrizing. Now, I may not get that word right. It's a little bit of a tongue twister for me, but I might also be obsessed with it and start using it everywhere I go, thanks to you. So, but in any event, that really speaks to me, and I bet I'm not alone in it being something that speaks to people. I've been honest about this from the very first episode of this podcast. I grew up in a familial situation that was chaotic, violent. I was traumatized because of that. And we went to family therapy. And what was the outcome? Your homie here was put on an antidepressant for a while so that I could make it through the day at school without wanting to just escape and hide and sleep. Imagine if instead of just having the depression that I really was feeling addressed in a way that was other than medicinal. For instance, by confronting the familial issues that were causing me to be depressed. Because let me tell you, when I was in a different situation, the depression magically went away. And so when we're talking about And when you say that there's this rabbit hole of things being automatically assumed to be a treatable, diagnosable illness as opposed to a natural human reaction to circumstances, that really speaks to me. And why is that so relevant? We're going to, by the way, have an episode a little bit later specifically talking about adolescence and psychedelics as a treatment modality for those who might be facing suicidal ideation and other severe
Mhm.
mental challenges. But let's be honest about this. If you're a child or a young person facing depression, and particularly if it's in a situation like mine, where there's no reason to believe that there was an actual genotype structure or genotype type that I fit into in the brain that would explain it,
Mhm.
then not even having the discussion, psychiatrizing everything, is actually really destructive. Structural challenges to how people treat each other, what is acceptable within a familial context, can become normalized for the worsening of society. And so when you're talking about young people not having, or school counselors, or mental health workers that might come into contact, administrations of children's services or things like that, that might be coming into contact with kids that are having troubles, not even being able to have that conversation with people, we could be talking about, as I'm understanding it, lives being at stake. Am I being overly dramatic here?
No, no, not at all. And yeah, I go that way too. It's like, what is the big problem? I don't like to stay there too long. I like to go into solutions. But you're right. Like there's something there. What can we do to fix it?
And to me, to deprive people of every solution that there is, well, it's something that is worthy of a conversation. But then you talked also a minute ago about something even deeper than that, which is what I call plant medicine as a doorway to creativity or intellectual agility or peak performance. And that is something, microdosing. You hear people talking about that as adults. I'm hearing you say it may be worthy of a conversation around exploring it with a larger group of people. Talk to me a little bit about how you can justify that to those who might be saying, "Whoa,
Yeah.
this is someone who is pushing people to alter their brain chemistry or their brain structure before they're even 18."
Yeah, and I think this bridges well from the ideas before that we were talking about, where I have this. It might even sound counterintuitive to what I just described, but there's a psychiatrist. His name is George Engel, who developed this model. I don't know if he named it anything other than biopsychosocial, but essentially, it's like the interrelationship between your biology, your psychology, and your socioeconomic status and your sociology. And I actually really like that because
Mm.
you're not just focusing on the chemical
Mhm.
imbalance of the biology, you're not just focusing on the mental side of the psychology, and you're also including the socioeconomic status, your friends, your community, your family makeup, that kind of stuff in that model. I don't think that's exactly his model, but if I was to rebuild that model, which I kind of start to in a lot of ways with what I do for my own personal health, is what it's missing is spirituality. And I think that that's really the bridge to the other topic you were having. So I feel like, you can pretty well organize every individual under those four categories of bio, psychosocial, spiritual. And the spiritual part is, I feel like, the missing link for a lot of people to feel more healthy. Because I think psychedelics are a way to help people engage with spirituality in their own unique way. Because I think a lot of the topic around spirituality lately, it's changing, but for the last 1,000+ years, it's all been
Yeah.
about religion. And that has given people, I think, a bad taste. I think people have a bad connotation to that. So I think psychedelics are allowing us to kind of open up the door again around what spirituality means. And I'm talking about someone who's like, until I really engaged with psychedelics, had never really thought of myself as spiritual, didn't like the word, thought it was all about religion, but then really started to open up to that. And I think that is where I like to see this go, because lots of things can fit into spirituality. Mental health can fit into that,
Mm.
right? Therapy can fit into that. But family relations, like you talked about your parents and your family makeup. Like imagine they had the ability to work with MDMA with a couples therapist, and they could have gotten to the root problems
Mhm.
of their core wounds of why they are treating each other the way they are because of their parents and this ancestral lineage that we're trying to break in a lot of ways. And I think spirituality can have a role in that. And then yeah, like I said, there are many innovations that have come from the use of psychedelics. The discovery of DNA is one of those, but the PCR tests that we use for COVID, the PCR technique, it was developed by another Nobel Prize winner named Kerry Mullis, and he accredits understanding and creating the PCR technique to
Mm.
an LSD experience
Wow.
as
I
well. So there's
I had
some,
no idea. I'd never heard
yeah,
that
there's
before. That just sort of that was a
yeah,
jaw
there's some
dropper.
in LSD. Yeah, LSD is a real creative uh, medicine. There's a bunch more. I mean, the Beatles, Steve Jobs, and Apple, like all of those things. There's a real undertone of psychedelic creation there, and that to me is a bigger part of culture. um, Understanding our DNA is massive. I mean, I can connect the dots back from my own personal experience of understanding and being able to do the gene testing to know that I have that low
Mhm.
functioning genotype. I can accredit that before I even took psychedelics back to Francis Crick,
Mm.
who uncovered the structure of our DNA during an
Mhm.
LSD experience. So for me, it's bigger. It's much bigger than just therapy when you have things like that that have been created and have had such an impact on our culture and society. Where today, as they become more mainstream, if we limit them to just putting them in the box of therapy, we're missing out on a big opportunity, I think, in a lot of ways, a huge opportunity to create the change I think a lot of us want to see in the world. And I think a key component to that is the inclusion of spirituality in our everyday lives in a more organic, authentic, less dogmatic way.
So, for those who are interested in the topic of the impact of the psychedelic renaissance on religious faith specifically, I do recommend that anyone watching or listening to this episode check out the episode interviewing Owen Fitzpatrick, which dives deeply into that topic. What would you say to those that would argue that rolling in discussions about spirituality into conversations around plant medicine usage that children might have ultimately lead to
Mm,
institutions advertently or inadvertently shoving a spiritual agenda down the
right.
throats of an underage population?
So the argument also backwards is, what right does any teacher, let's say in an institution, have in influencing our youth when it comes to their gender or their sex or their identity? To me, like that's a really interesting topic as well that isn't getting enough discussion. But I'm not going to go there for that. But it does connect to your point where it's like, what do these institutions? What are their roles? What are the people's roles inside of those institutions in these bigger picture cultural topics? Right? You've got in school, you've got history, geography, math, sciences. Those are all things that, in a lot of ways are fact based, and there's not a lot of,
Right.
in between. When it comes to religion, I went to a Catholic school. When it comes to religion, when it comes to spirituality, these things are more subjective and they're more individual. And I think that it actually is like it's kind of going above a bit further and going. We need to have. I think, in my opinion, I would have loved to have a more individual style, personalized style of learning, where I can learn about my own spirituality, not be indoctrinated into one way or the other. I just went to a Catholic school, so I only got one religious sort of understanding, which was then my context for spirituality. But I never learned about Buddhism, but I now, or Taoism, I now more aligned to the Tao or to
Mm.
Buddhist philosophy. But I had to go and figure
Mhm.
that out all on my own later, which is awesome. I don't regret any of that. But what if we had a little bit more freedom from really earlier ages to understand and explore spirituality as a component to all the other things? But that isn't, and this is the tough part, which is what you alluded to, which is where it doesn't become a
Right.
dogmatic. indoctrinated sort of piece coming from whoever the teacher is that day and whatever their experience is. That's where it's getting messy. But I think to me, and I'll land on this, like, agree with me or not, anyone who's listening, and I love all of this, but to me, it's all about dialogue. Dialogue comes from the root word dia, which means moving towards, and logos, which means meaning. So dialogue is what we need. We just need to keep moving towards meaning, keep having these discussions. Don't be afraid to be wrong. Like, I can be totally wrong about this, and I'm okay with that. But I just know that it's what's currently in place isn't working, and we need to change it. And I think honesty about drugs and a more personalized approach to our holistic way of being, or maybe a more integrative way of being, again, bringing in biopsychosocial, spiritual, holistic, integrative, and personal. If we can do that and find a way to do that over time, I think our kids are going to grow up in a much better, more inclusive, more open environment where they can feel free to be themselves, feel free to be wrong, feel free to challenge authority, feel free to innovate and change. Where I see us heading right now with where we're at, it's just hiding all that uniqueness from all of us and kind of putting us in this box. And I don't want that to
I'm going to
happen.
use that as an opportunity to sweep back then to the conversation about innovation and creativity. But before we do that, I
Mhm.
do have to say you raise the issue of how things are taught and the framing that we have around particular things when we make choices about what to have dialogues with young people about, whether at home or in institutions, and assumptions or the indirect lessons that someone can learn around that. So, for instance, there are those who argue that in schools, you should not be allowed to discuss sexual orientation or gender roles. But that then has underneath it assumptions about correct or non correct sexual orientations or gender roles are. And that isn't the only subject that is like that, or that can, that has embedded within it these framing assumptions. It's just one that's very, it's been a hot topic for the past few years. This was filmed in May of 2023. It's just something that's in the news every day at this point. And so we were able to
Mhm.
analogize that to the discussion around substances like psychedelics and the assumptions that might be embedded within the framing that we have when we have these discussions. It actually is a fair and important analogy for us to have. Now, creativity and
Mhm.
innovation. One thing that I learned being in New York City on 9/11 is that life can end in a snap. One day you're at work fiddling paper in your office building, the next, that office building has crumbled around you in a terrorist attack. That's what I took away from that day, among many other things. And so life is short, and we don't have an infinite time to be able to create, to innovate, because the possibility could end in a snap, or we could be hit by a car. Am I correct in hearing from you that a dialogue around plant medicines and psychedelics as a creative and innovation basis for how people think and what they do with the limited time that we have on this earth is something that you would want packaged within the whole set of discussions that we might be bringing into the dialogues that we have with people at a younger and younger age?
Mhm. Yeah, I think in general, just to like even bookend that last point that I made, was we just need more forums. We just need more forums to have these types of discussions. And I think when it comes to the polarizing discussions, of gender roles and drugs and sex and that, it needs to be, to me, I think what I think would be a really more holistic approach would be to have forums where parents are
Mm-hmm.
involved in all of that as well. So instead of it being a class on that, or instead of it being a topic of discussion in today's curriculum, it's the parents and the teachers and the students all engaged in the discussion, instead of it being like, we're going to create the curriculum up here and the parents are going to just trust that it works, and the kids don't have any say in sort of
Mm-hmm.
what they're learning or how they're learning, or you know what I mean. So if there was a way to figure out how it can be more inclusive of everybody, then I think we're going to get to what everybody wants, which is more inclusivity. But right now it's the system that's the problem, not the people. I don't want to blame anyone specifically, but the system of how we do things is is the thing that's the problem. And if we fix the system, that will change the outcomes in a lot of ways, as well as create new challenges and new problems. So to me, it's the system, not the people. And I think more forums to discuss this openly is the approach. And to your last point, yeah, about, I mean, creativity. Like, yeah, you're a plane could fly through your office building at any moment. You could get struck by a bus. You have a heart attack. There are many reasons to avoid doing the thing that's pulling at you from your heart, but the longer you wait, the less chance you have because you're dying every moment. But you can also choose to live and create in every moment too. But I think it's just more of a again, I don't know. You were kind of tying it back there, I guess, to the youth stuff. So I think there's a bit there. I don't know if I would. I don't know when the right time is to be like, hey, these things can be used for creativity. I think it's obviously when there's a certain age. I think if you look at cannabis, they say between like 21 and 25, especially for men, the brain's
Hmm.
evolved. Maybe that's when you start talking about it in that way. Um, but I think, yeah, just in general, more open dialogue, more forum for this type of discussion would allow us to really, I think, get the benefits of what these compounds can do. And and I think the part of the answer there too is also to look at how the traditional societies have used these things too. They weren't just about medicine back back when they were, first understood and found. And so a lot of the first creations were developed through that. You look at the old cave paintings of how societies were formed. A lot of that, if you read the book, The Immortality Key, like how ancient religion and how ancient cultures were using plant medicines in different ways. Some sort of elitist type, black
Hmm.
magic type stuff, but then some like really creative and really innovative. And I think there's probably a lot of that we don't understand. But if we dig and we poke and we try to unearth some of that, I think we'll understand that. And if I was to go, 50 years into the future and look back, and I will be able to, hopefully, be able to rewatch this and go, wow, we opened it up and it wasn't just about therapy, and look what was created because of this, and look at this world. And I'm not trying to be this utopian sort of like, I understand that there's a lot of challenges with all of this, but I'm negatively or positively or to the detriment of, who I am and my character. I'm an optimist and I will always be an optimist. And I just believe that there's more to it than what we're currently exploring here with these compounds.
A couple of final questions. First of all, the advantage of the what I'll call scared straight approach is that it doesn't downplay risk. Don't you get a little bit
Mhm.
scared that in the excitement around having broader, more detailed dialogues around these substances for younger people in this imaginary future, risks can be just sort of thrown away into the background? And how
Mhm.
would that be a world we would want to live in?
Yeah, good point. Because I don't want to just sit here and throw pie in the sky, beautiful scenarios out to you and just hope for the best. Because there are some really really um, important risks to consider. But that's the honest approach, right?
Mm,
That's what I was saying before about this open dialogue is the thing that I think is missing in helping kids understand what the benefits are and the risks are of these things, and what they're getting into. But also, what about birth control? What about SSRIs and the damage that those
yeah.
do? We don't get a lot of that. All it is like get on birth control as soon as you're 13. If you're a female, I think it is like around that time. As soon as you hit puberty, get on birth control. But now there are all these studies coming out showing how problematic that has been, and then you look at SSRIs that really, there's some really major studies out there that have shown they're not really effective at all. And so it's like we've been psychiatrized to believe that all of these drugs are super beneficial, but we were never given the risks for those either. So it's kind of the opposite approach. So I wonder. And again, I'm not trying to like make my point here. What I'm trying to say is it's definitely important to talk about the risks, but the full spectrum of risks of everything, legal and illegal, so that it's a complete, honest, open discussion about
And
it. I believe.
look, I'm an attorney by training. I find it hard to argue with that one. So what does that say? Again, it goes back to framing and what boxes we're putting
Yeah,
things in and the assumptions behind them. Corey, what
yeah.
would this future world? You mentioned earlier that when your children grow up, you would want things to look differently for them. So let's think about, let's say, 2030? What might the world look like when it comes to having discussions with young people about various compounds, such as psychedelics, or specifically psychedelics, that they might encounter?
Yeah, well, like I just said, I think it's more for me by 2030. If I could put a future vision out there, I it's more than just psychedelics. It has to be psychedelics have to be included in the broader discussion of around honest drug use, drug interaction, and the benefits, risks, needs for these types of compounds, not just psychedelics, everything. Like I mentioned, birth control, SSRIs, fentanyl, heroin, all these different things, all these compounds that we use for all these different things. I think what I would love to just see is that discussion change from it being, here are the benefits of taking SSRIs, and then here's just a pamphlet of some risks you might want to read, to right. So it's this kind of what I'm doing, right, where it's this benefit, and I'm not talking about the risks. So
Mm,
I'm trying to bridge that
mhm,
together and know that, like, you're bringing up a really good point for me even to understand and to make sure that I'm talking about this more inclusively, because it has to be both. It's both and you have to look at it in, I think we believe, and I need to do this as well, is just look at the fullest picture of what we're talking about here when it comes to drugs, and it not just be about psychedelics and mind altering substances, but that how the chemicals in our brains work, and how things like breath work or meditation
mhm,
can influence the
mhm,
chemicals in our brain, and we don't even
mhm,
need drugs. So
mhm.
starting kids there, and then maybe they don't need the psychedelics because they found a really good breathwork
Right.
practice that helps them reach that understanding and help them move beyond troubling emotions or whatever it is. So, there's different ways, and I'm not kind of giving you, because I don't have a blueprint for this. Like I'm not an educator. I'm just a
Mhm.
curious individual that has a lot of hope for society, and a kid that I want to
Mm,
see kind of grow up in something new. And so I think that's it, like the fullest spectrum of understanding of chemicals in our society and in our healthcare system, and in our wellness. And then I would say, just from the education perspective, I really hope that, and that, she's not in a Rose is not in a place where she's at a daycare, but she's not in, sort of the education system quite yet, where I want to be involved. I want to know what the curriculum is. I want to know what the teachers' opinions are about things and what their biases are, and not to judge them or to shame them, but to just know what's there so that I can help teach Rose over time as she evolves and gets more awareness. How all of that stuff, everything that we're learning from everybody, comes from a history, comes from a bias, and that it's important to make your own judgments, and it's important to make your own decisions, and it's important to be critical, and it's important to challenge what you believe to be not true or unjust. And everybody should be like that. The more people that are like that, the better off we'll be, because we'll get to the root, and we'll get to the facts, and we'll remove any need for fluff and for indecisiveness, or um, in a lot of ways, I think this this sort of in between, where we're not really talking about things that are existing and that are becoming way more prevalent than we would like them to be, specifically this opioid crisis that we're in, or this mental health crisis that we're in. And so I think it's a bigger, broader discussion, some open forums, more integrative discussion, and an education system that is more honest and more approachable for everybody who wants to participate in how our kids are raised and how they're, educated over time.
That sounds like an incredible stump speech. And I don't know about you, but after I hear a powerful speech, I like to find out more about the person who I've just listened to. So, Cory, where can people go to find out more about you?
LinkedIn's probably the best. I spend most of my time sharing anything mostly on LinkedIn. So at Cory Firth. I'm on Instagram a little bit. I tend to kind of take breaks from that. I find it a little bit too much sometimes. So, but at Cory Firth there, but I don't post there that often. Maybe I should. But and then Neuma, we're creating something pretty special here in Canada, I think. And you can find us at Neuma Center on Instagram and neumacenter.com. And yeah, I think that's it. Those are the
I
places
love
I
it.
hang out.
Cory, it has been spectacular talking with you today. Thank you so much. And particularly for raising issues that might not necessarily be comfortable for people to hear, but for us to truly live out the way that we claim we want to, as mentioned at the top of the hour. In honesty, this is the sort of conversation that needs to occur. We have episodes coming up, some of which I referenced during this hour, but some of which I might not have, that are very exciting. Episodes about psychedelics and yoga, psychedelics as a leadership training modality, psychedelics and the aging process, and much, much more. We even have an episode coming up about how psychedelics can help you if you're a toxic boss. That, I think, will speak to a lot of people. So, if you enjoyed today's episode and want to learn more, be sure to follow us on one of our social media platforms: Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube, and make sure that you leave us a positive review on your favorite audio podcast platform, or a positive comment on YouTube if you've watched us there. If you have enjoyed today's episode, please tell everyone that you know about what we're doing so that they can tune in and go along on the journey with us. And then make sure that you go to our website, webdelics.com. That's WEBDELICS.com. Sign up for our blog, and you can read accurate, unbiased, and credible information about psychedelics and plant medicine. In fact, the most so on the web. And finally, be sure to come back next time for another episode of the Webdelics podcast.